There exists a peculiar kind of suffering that millions endure daily yet few can name. It isn't physical pain that tears through the body with sharp clarity, nor is it the grief of loss that announces itself with ceremonies and condolences. This suffering is quieter, more insidious. It lives in the space between moments, in the gap between what is and what the mind imagines could be. It is the suffering of living entirely within one's own head. Morning arrives, and before feet touch the floor, the mind is already racing. A conversation from yesterday replays with different words, better responses, sharper comebacks. A meeting scheduled for next week spawns 1,000 variations, each one practiced, refined, worried over, until the actual event seems secondary to its mental rehearsal. The present moment, the texture of sheets, the quality of morning light, the simple act of breathing, goes unnoticed, crowded out by the cacophony of thought. This is the existence of most people. They wake not into the world, but into their thoughts about the world. They live not in reality, but in an elaborate simulation running constantly between their ears. Every interaction becomes a script to analyze. Every decision branches into infinite hypotheticals. Every silence fills with commentary, judgment, planning, and regret. The mind becomes not a tool for engaging with life, but a barrier that stands between the self and direct experience. Consider the man who attends a gathering. Physically, he is present. His body occupies space, his voice contributes to conversation, but internally, he is elsewhere entirely. He watches himself from a distance, critiquing his performance. Did that joke land? Why did she look away when he was speaking? He should have mentioned that accomplishment. He sounds too eager, too reserved, too something. The actual party, with its real interactions and genuine moments, passes by unnoticed while he remains trapped in this meta-analysis, experiencing not the event itself but his thoughts about the event. This imprisonment in thought creates a peculiar kind of suffering, because it is entirely self-inflicted, yet feels utterly real. The anxieties that consume hours of mental energy exist only as electrical patterns in the brain, yet they generate genuine cortisol, real tension, authentic misery. A person can ruin their day worrying about an email they need to send, then spend the evening replaying the conversation that never went as badly as they feared. The suffering is real. The cause is entirely imaginary. The tragedy deepens when we recognize how this mental imprisonment affects every aspect of existence. Relationships suffer because we respond not to the person before us, but to our interpretation of their words, our assumptions about their intentions, our fears about what they might think. We argue with phantoms of our own creation. A partner says something neutral, perhaps even kind, but the mind processes it through layers of past hurt, projected future abandonment, and present insecurity, until what was simple becomes complex. What was loving becomes threatening. Work becomes torturous when lived entirely in the head. The task at hand receives only partial attention, because the mind is simultaneously calculating how it will be received, what it might lead to, whether it's good enough, whether it proves worth or exposes inadequacy. Simple actions that could take minutes stretch into hours, because the doing is interrupted constantly by thinking about the doing. The writer stares at a blank page, not because words won't come, but because every word that does come is immediately judged, found wanting, erased before it can breathe. The artist's hand freezes because the inner critic speaks louder than creative impulse. The entrepreneur doesn't launch because the mind can catalogue 1,000 ways things might fail. Living in the head also robs life of its sensory richness. Food loses flavor because the meal is spent photographing, posting, worrying about calories, thinking about the next meal, anywhere but in the actual experience of eating. Music becomes background noise because attention is on planning, ruminating, rehearsing. A walk in nature turns into a moving meditation on problems. The trees and sky mere scenery to the mind's theatre. The body walks. The mind is in the office, in yesterday, in next year, anywhere but the trail beneath actual feet. This mental existence creates a fundamental disconnection from reality. Life happens in the present moment. That's the only place it can happen. But the thinking mind exists almost entirely in past and future. It replays what was, trying to edit it, extract different meanings, settle old scores. It projects what might be, planning, worrying, fantasizing, dreading. The sliver of time that is now, the only time that actually exists, gets almost no attention. We become like someone watching life on a screen while the real thing happens behind us, unnoticed. The exhaustion that comes from living this way is profound. Thinking is metabolically expensive. The brain, representing only 2% of body weight, consumes 20% of the body's energy. When that brain is running constant simulations, playing out scenarios, maintaining narratives, the energy drain is immense. People collapse at day's end not from physical exertion, but from the sheer effort of maintaining this thought stream, this constant internal monologue that narrates, judges, plans, and worries without pause. Worse still, this mental imprisonment creates a false self. The person living entirely in their head begins to believe they are their thoughts. They identify with the voice in their head, taking its judgments as truth, its fears as reality, its narratives as identity. I am anxious becomes not a description of a temporary state, but a definition of self. I am not good enough shifts from a thought that passes through awareness to a fundamental truth about existence. The identification is so complete that questioning these thoughts feels like questioning existence itself. This false self, built entirely from thought, is inherently weak. It must be constantly defended because it has no actual substance. It's a story told by the mind about the mind, a house of cards that requires constant maintenance. Every slight becomes a threat because it might disturb the narrative. Every failure becomes catastrophic because it challenges the identity. Every success brings only temporary relief because the thought-based self can never be satisfied. There's always another worry, another inadequacy, another way things might fall apart. The man who lives entirely in his head becomes a puppet of his own thoughts. He reacts not to reality, but to his interpretation of reality. He makes decisions not based on what is, but on elaborate scenarios of what might be. He suffers not from actual circumstances, but from the horror movie his mind creates. He is destroyed not by external forces, but by internal narratives that run unchecked, gathering power, creating suffering from nothing but electrical impulses and chemical reactions. And here lies the deepest tragedy. None of this is necessary. The prison has no walls except those the mind builds and maintains. The suffering is real, but its cause is optional. Everything, absolutely everything, changes the moment one stops living in their head. But to understand how this change happens, we must first understand what has been built in that mental prison, what weak self has been constructed from pure thought, and why its destruction is not loss, but liberation. The weak self is not who you are. It is who you think you are. It is a collection of stories, mostly inherited, rarely examined. It is built from childhood wounds given narrative form, from societal expectations internalized as personal truth, from random events interpreted as patterns, from fears projected as facts. This weak self believes it is protecting you, but it is actually imprisoning you. It believes it is you, but it is only a thought structure that has become so familiar you mistake it for reality. Consider how this weak self operates. It needs constant validation because it has no inherent worth. It's just a story, and stories need audiences to exist. It creates drama because intensity helps it feel real. It resists change because change threatens its narrative. It interprets neutral events as personal affronts because victimhood gives it purpose. It remembers every slight and forgets every kindness because grievance is more useful to its story than gratitude. It compares constantly because without comparison, hierarchy, and judgment, it would have no framework for understanding value. This weak self speaks in absolutes. I always fail. Nobody likes me. I can't do that. This is just how I am. These statements feel true because they've been repeated so often, but they're simply thoughts that have calcified into pseudo-facts. The weak self deals in certainty because uncertainty would expose it as the fiction it is. It knows everything about what you can't do, what will go wrong, why you shouldn't try, what others are thinking. This knowledge, of course, is entirely imaginary, but the weak self presents it with such authority that it goes unchallenged. The tragedy unfolds when we organize our entire lives around protecting this weak self. We avoid opportunities because the weak self declares them beyond us. We stay in miserable situations because the weak self fears the unknown more than it hates the present. We don't speak up because the weak self predicts humiliation. We don't try because the weak self has already written the story of failure. Every day, we sacrifice actual possibilities on the altar of imaginary limitations. What would change if this weak self were destroyed? Not damaged, not wounded, not temporarily suppressed, but actually destroyed, dismantled, seen through so completely that it could never again be mistaken for reality. This is not a comfortable question. The weak self is familiar. It's been with us so long we can't imagine existence without it. To even consider its destruction feels like contemplating death itself. And in a way, it is a kind of death. But it is the death of a ghost, the ending of a nightmare, the destruction of something that never truly existed, except as a persistent hallucination. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This statement seems paradoxical. How can destruction lead to indestructibility? How can losing what seems like self result in an unassailable self? The answer lies in understanding what remains when the false is stripped away, what stands when the thought structure collapses, what is real when the imaginary dissolves. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand the indestructible nature that emerges after the weak self's destruction, we must fully grasp the mechanism of mental imprisonment, the architecture of thought-based suffering, the specific ways that living in one's head creates the very weaknesses it claims to protect against. We must see clearly what we are to understand what we might become. The mind creates suffering through several distinct mechanisms, each one clever in its ability to seem helpful while actually causing harm. Understanding these mechanisms is the first step toward freedom, the beginning of the end of mental imprisonment. First, there is rumination, the endless recycling of thoughts about the past. Something happened, a conversation, a failure, an embarrassment. The event is over, existing now only in memory, yet the mind returns to it compulsively. It replays the scene, trying different variations, searching for different meanings, attempting to rewrite what cannot be changed. Each replay adds layers of interpretation, extracts new reasons for shame or anger, discovers fresh ways to feel wronged or inadequate. The actual event, which occupied perhaps minutes of real time, comes to occupy hours, days, years of mental time. It becomes not a memory but an active wound, constantly picked at, never allowed to heal. Second, there is anticipation, the projection of elaborate futures that exist only as possibility. The mind takes upcoming events and creates detailed scenarios of how they might unfold. Usually these scenarios lean toward disaster. The presentation becomes a humiliation. The date becomes a rejection. The opportunity becomes a trap. The mind justifies this negative forecasting as preparation, as prudence, as realism. But it's actually a form of preemptive suffering. We torture ourselves with visions of future pain that may never arrive, and even if it does, we'll have suffered twice. Once in imagination, once in reality. Third, there is comparison, the habit of measuring self against others and finding deficiency. The mind creates elaborate hierarchies. Who has more? Who is better? Who is ahead? Who is winning? It takes the incomparable, each person's unique existence, and forces it into rankings. The result is guaranteed dissatisfaction, because there will always be someone with more money, more success, more followers, more beauty, more of whatever the mind has decided equals worth. Even victory brings no peace because the mind immediately identifies new competitions to lose. Fourth, there is identification, the mistake of believing we are our thoughts, feelings, and experiences. When a thought of anxiety arises, we become an anxious person. When anger appears, we become an angry person. Every passing mental state is taken as evidence of fundamental nature. This identification makes change seem impossible. If I am my anxiety, how can I ever be free of it? If I am my past, how can I ever create a different future? The mind traps itself in these identifications, mistaking temporary visitors for permanent residents. Fifth, there is resistance, the constant argument with reality. The mind insists that what is should be different. It rains, but it shouldn't. The relationship ended, but it shouldn't have. Someone was rude, but they shouldn't have been. This argument with reality is exhausting and completely futile. Reality doesn't care about our preferences. What is. But the mind wages endless war against this simple fact, creating suffering not from the situation itself, but from the refusal to accept it. These mechanisms interlock and reinforce each other. Rumination feeds identification. I am someone who failed. Anticipation amplifies comparison. They will see I'm not as good as her. Resistance strengthens rumination. That shouldn't have happened, so I can't let it go. The mind becomes a self-sustaining machine for generating suffering, each gear turning the others, the whole system running on nothing but the electricity of neurons and the chemistry of stress. The exhausting irony is that none of these mental activities achieve anything useful. Rumination doesn't change the past. Anticipation doesn't prevent the future. Comparison doesn't improve performance. Identification doesn't reveal truth. Resistance doesn't alter reality. Yet the mind engages in all of them obsessively, convinced that somehow this time, finally, thinking will solve what only living can address. Living in the head also creates a powerful distortion. It makes us believe we are separate from life itself. The thinking mind creates a subject-object split. There is me in here in the head, and there is world out there, separate, often threatening. This division seems self-evident because it's how language works, how thoughts function, but it's a fabrication. Life is not something happening to a separate self. Life is happening as self. There is no boundary, no separation, except the conceptual one created by thought. This illusory separation creates profound loneliness. When we live in our heads, we live in isolation. The voice in the head is our only companion, and it's not even a friendly one. It's a critical companion, an anxious companion, a judgmental companion. We are alone with this voice, cut off from genuine connection because even when with others, we're actually with our thoughts about others. The loneliness of mental existence is absolute because we have literally separated ourselves from everything that exists. The prison tightens further because the thinking mind cannot solve the problems it creates. You cannot think your way out of overthinking. You cannot mentally escape mental imprisonment. The mind will offer solutions, new beliefs to adopt, new strategies to implement, new ways to manage thoughts. But all of these are just more thinking, more mental activity, tighter walls in the prison. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. The substance causing the problem cannot fix the problem. This is where many people get stuck. They recognize they're suffering from mental activity, so they try to think differently. Positive thinking instead of negative thinking. Affirmations instead of criticism. Better stories instead of worse stories. These approaches can provide temporary relief, but they don't address the fundamental issue. Identification with thinking itself. The prison gets redecorated, but it's still a prison. What's needed is not better thinking, but a different relationship to thinking altogether. Not mental control, but mental freedom. Not victory over the mind, but liberation from it. This requires something radical. It requires actually stepping out of the head, even briefly, even once, to discover what exists beyond thought's dominion. And this is precisely where everything changes. Part 2. The death of the weak self. The moment of stepping out of one's head rarely arrives as a dramatic event. Despite what spiritual stories sometimes suggest, it's usually not a thunderbolt of realization that forever alters consciousness. More often, it arrives quietly, almost accidentally, in small moments when the mind's grip briefly loosens. It might happen during a morning when something interrupts the usual pattern. The mind is churning as always, planning the day, worrying about problems, replaying yesterday, when suddenly a bird's song penetrates the mental noise. Just for a second, there is pure listening. Not listening with commentary, not listening while thinking about listening, but just the sound itself, arriving in awareness without the filter of thought. In that second, there is no me listening to a bird. There is only listening happening. The subject-object division dissolves. The thinker disappears. There is just this. Or perhaps it happens in a moment of crisis. Everything has gone wrong. The careful plans have collapsed. The identity built over years has been shattered by circumstances. In the devastation, exhausted from struggling, the mind finally stops its desperate attempt to fix, explain, or escape. In that stopping, in that surrender, there is a strange peace. Not because the situation has improved, it hasn't, but because the mental warfare has ceased. The reality remains difficult, but without the layer of mental resistance and narrative, it's somehow bearable. Without the story of victimhood, there's just a situation to navigate. Without the identity to protect, there's freedom to respond, fresh. Or maybe it arrives through a practice. Meditation for those who persist beyond the first frustrating weeks occasionally yields moments of unexpected clarity. The instructions are simple. Notice when you're thinking, and return attention to breath. For hundreds of repetitions, this feels mechanical and pointless. The mind wanders, you notice. You return, wander, notice, return. And then one time, in the gap between noticing the thought and returning to breath, there's space, a pause, a silence that isn't empty but somehow full. In that pause, you realize you're not the thought you just noticed. You're whatever is noticing the thought. And if you're not that thought, maybe you're not any thought. The identification, so total for so long, cracks slightly. These breakthrough moments share common characteristics. They all involve, however briefly, a cessation of identification with thinking. The mental narrator stops narrating. The internal commentator stops commenting. The thinker stops thinking. What remains is not nothing. It's not unconsciousness or absence. What remains is pure awareness, consciousness itself, the space in which all experience arises. In this space, even briefly experienced, everything is different. Problems that seemed overwhelming are simply situations. Futures that seemed terrifying are simply unknown. Pasts that seem to define the present are simply memories, no more substantial than dreams. The drama drains away. What remains is strangely simple. But here's what makes these moments truly revolutionary. They reveal the weak self as fiction. When you step out of your head, even for a moment, you see clearly that the voice in your head is not you. It's just a voice, a pattern of words, a narrative function. The anxious person you thought you were is just anxiety passing through awareness. The inadequate person you believed yourself to be is just a thought of inadequacy. The entire elaborate structure of identity, all the stories, all the wounds, all the characteristics, is revealed as a thought construct, as substantial as a shadow. This revelation is initially disturbing. If I'm not my thoughts, and I'm not my story, and I'm not the person I've believed myself to be for decades, then what am I? The question creates vertigo. The foundation of existence seems to crack. This is the moment many people retreat, rushing back into the comfort of familiar mental patterns. Better to live in a known prison than face the unknown territory beyond its walls. But for those who stay with the question, who allow the old structure to crumble without immediately building a new one, something extraordinary emerges. What you are when the thought-based self is stripped away is not a thing at all. It's not a fixed identity or a stable entity. It's the awareness itself, the consciousness within which all experience happens. It's not personal, it's the space in which persons appear. It's not vulnerable. It has no characteristics that could be attacked. It's not weak. It has no qualities that could be diminished. This is what remains when the weak self is destroyed. Not nothing, but everything. Not absence, but presence. Not a diminished self, but no separate self at all, which paradoxically means indestructible being. The process of destroying the weak self is not gentle. It cannot be. You cannot carefully dismantle something and keep the comfortable parts. The whole structure must go. This means every identity you've clung to, every story you've told yourself about who you are, every belief about your limitations and your wounds, all of it must be seen through and released. This process often begins with examining the stories we tell ourselves. We each carry narratives about our lives. I am someone who struggles with relationships because my parents divorced. I am anxious because I was bullied as a child. I am not creative because a teacher once criticized my work. These stories feel true because they've been repeated so often, and because they seem to explain our experience. But they're optional interpretations, not facts. A divorce happened. That's a fact. That it caused permanent relationship damage is a story. Bullying occurred. That's a fact. That it made you permanently anxious is a story. Criticism was received. That's a fact. That it destroyed your creativity is a story. The facts happened once. The stories happen every day. Every time they're believed and repeated. Destroying the weak self requires distinguishing fact from story. It means looking directly at these narratives and asking, is this actually true? Not, does it feel true, or has it been true in the past, but is it true right now in this moment? When you look closely, you find that most of these defining stories are not true in the present moment. They're memories, projections, interpretations, all mental constructs that exist only when thought gives them life. As stories are questioned and seen through, the identity they supported begins to collapse. This is uncomfortable because identity, even a painful identity, provides certainty. Even victim identity is seductive because it explains suffering and absolves responsibility. To release these stories is to stand in the unknown, without the familiar landmarks of self-definition. The discomfort intensifies because destroying the weak self also means feeling everything it was designed to avoid. The weak self, built from thought and maintained by narrative, actually serves as a buffer against direct experience. It stands between awareness and feeling, between consciousness and reality. When it crumbles, everything previously filtered through thought is now felt directly. This means feeling emotions without the story that makes sense of them. Sadness arises, but there's no narrative about why or what it means. It's just sadness, pure and simple, moving through like weather. Fear appears, but without the thoughts that justify and amplify it. It's simply sensation, tightness, acceleration, energy. Even difficult emotions, when experienced without the mental story, are remarkably manageable. It's not the feeling itself that overwhelms. It's the story about the feeling, the meaning assigned to it, the future it supposedly predicts. Destroying the weak self requires the willingness to be with what is, without the mental buffer, without the narrative protection. This is why it's genuinely difficult. We've spent a lifetime building elaborate defenses against direct experience. The thought stream is itself a defense, a way to stay one step removed from reality. To drop it is to stand naked in existence itself, undefended and immediate. Yet in this nakedness, something surprising happens. Without the weak self to protect, there's nothing to defend. Without the story to maintain, there's nothing to prove. Without the identity to uphold, there's nothing to lose. The very things we feared, exposure, humiliation, failure, lose their power because they can only threaten a false self that no longer runs the show. The man who destroys his weak self discovers something profound. He already is what he was trying to become. Confidence, peace, strength. These are not qualities to acquire but natural states that emerge when mental obscuration is removed. The weak self was the problem pretending to be the solution. It created the sense of inadequacy, then offered strategies for overcoming it. It generated the fear, then provided protection against it. It was both poison and supposed antidote. Without it, there is simply being. And being, unobstructed by thought-based identity, is naturally confident because it has nothing to prove. It is naturally peaceful because it is not at war with reality. It is naturally strong because it cannot be diminished. How do you diminish consciousness itself? This is not a state achieved through acquisition or accomplishment. It's what's already here when the mental overlay is removed. The weak self was the cloud obscuring the sun. Its destruction doesn't create light. It reveals the light that was always present. But how, specifically, does one destroy the weak self? If it's a structure built over decades, maintained by every thought and reinforced by every fear, how can it be dismantled? The answer lies not in another mental strategy, but in a shift of relationship to thinking itself. The key is recognizing that you are not the thinker, but the awareness of thinking. This sounds abstract, but it's directly verifiable. Right now, thoughts are happening. Notice them. In the noticing, there is a separation. Thoughts here, awareness there. You cannot be what you're observing. If you can watch thoughts arise and pass, you must be something other than the thoughts themselves. This awareness that notices thoughts is not itself a thought. It's the space in which thoughts occur. It doesn't come and go like thoughts do. It's constant, unchanging, present. This is what you actually are, not the changing content of consciousness, but consciousness itself. When this is truly seen, not just as an interesting idea, but as direct reality, everything shifts. Thoughts still arise, but they're no longer taken as truth or as self. They're recognized as events in awareness, like sounds or sensations. Some thoughts are useful. I need groceries, and can be acted on. Some thoughts are just noise. I'm such a failure, and can be ignored. The identification is broken. With identification broken, the weak self loses its foundation. It exists only as a cluster of believed thoughts. When thoughts are no longer believed automatically, when they're seen as mental events rather than truth, the weak self has nothing to stand on. It's like a character in a movie trying to exist after the projector is turned off. It was only ever a play of light and shadow. This destruction of the weak self is not violent or aggressive. It's more like waking from a dream. The dream can be terrifying, fully convincing while it lasts. But the moment of waking reveals it was never real. The monsters had no substance. The danger was imaginary. You were never actually threatened because it was all projection, all mind created. The relief is immense. Yet even as relief comes, fear may arise. If the weak self is destroyed, what will protect me? What will guide decisions? What will provide identity in the world? These questions reveal that the weak self is still being mistaken for something necessary, something protective. But the truth is that the weak self never protected anything. It created the vulnerability it claimed to guard against. Real protection comes not from thought-based identity, but from clear perception and appropriate response. When the mind is not clouded by narrative and fear, you see situations clearly. You respond to what is, not to your interpretation of what is. This is far more effective than the weak self strategies of avoidance, overthinking, and defensive posturing. As for identity in the world, you discover that you don't need a fixed identity. You can function perfectly well without knowing precisely who you are. In fact, you function better because you're not trying to make reality conform to some image of self. You respond freshly to each situation, rather than playing out predetermined patterns. The man who has destroyed his weak self moves through the world differently. Where others see threats, he sees situations. Where others feel inadequate, he feels curious. Where others need to prove themselves, he simply acts. This doesn't mean he's superior. Comparison itself is a function of the weak self. It means he's free from the particular form of suffering that comes from living in one's head and identifying with thought-based identity. Can he still be hurt? Certainly. The body can be injured, circumstances can be painful, loss can bring grief. But he cannot be destroyed in the way the weak self could be destroyed because there's no brittle identity to shatter. Pain is just pain, not a statement about worth. Failure is just an outcome, not an identity. Criticism is just information, not an assault on self. This is what makes him indestructible, not because nothing can affect him, but because there's no false self to protect. The vulnerable thing was the thought construct, and it's gone. What remains is awareness itself, and awareness cannot be hurt, cannot fail, cannot be diminished. It simply is. The process of reaching this state is not comfortable, which is why most people never undertake it. They sense, perhaps, that the journey would require too much. They would have to question everything, release everything, stand without the familiar supports of identity and story. The weak self, for all its suffering, is known. What lies beyond is unknown. Better to endure familiar misery than risk the uncertainty of transformation. But for those willing to make the journey, what awaits is not just relief from suffering, but a completely different relationship with existence. Life becomes immediate rather than mediated. Experience becomes direct rather than filtered through thought. Action becomes spontaneous rather than calculated. And in this immediacy, this directness, this spontaneity, there is a vitality that the head-bound life could never offer. Part 3. Life beyond the head. When the weak self is destroyed and the prison of thought is left behind, a question arises. What now? If I'm not the voice in my head, if I'm not the story I've been telling, if I'm not protecting and maintaining an identity, then how do I live? What guides action? What provides meaning? These questions reveal a lingering assumption that without the thinking mind running the show, there would be chaos or paralysis. The reality is precisely the opposite. Life beyond the head is not diminished but enriched. Action doesn't cease but flows. Meaning doesn't vanish but deepens. Everything that was supposedly provided by thought-based identity emerges more authentically when that identity is gone. Living beyond the head means living from presence rather than from thought. Presence is not a mystical concept. It's simply being here, now, aware of what is. Most people have experienced this accidentally. A moment of such beauty or intensity that thinking stopped and there was just the raw experience itself. Perhaps watching a sunset so stunning that commentary ceased. Perhaps in a moment of emergency when there was no time to think, only to act. Perhaps during an activity so engaging, sport, art, conversation, that the sense of separate self dissolved into pure doing. These moments reveal what's possible when the mental overlay is removed. The sunset isn't experienced through thoughts about sunsets or comparisons to other sunsets or planning to photograph it. It's just pure perception, color and light and space, unfiltered. The emergency response isn't confused by overthinking, but clear and immediate. The engaging activity doesn't feel like me doing something, but like doing happening through a body, effortless and aligned. This is available not just in special moments, but as a constant state. It's our natural condition, obscured only by habitual thinking. When thought identification breaks, presence is what remains. And from presence, life unfolds quite differently than it does from the thinking mind. From presence, decisions become simpler. The thinking mind agonizes over choices, projecting endless scenarios, weighing infinite factors, trying to predict unpredictable futures. Presence simply feels into what's true now and moves accordingly. This isn't impulsive, it's aligned. There's a felt sense, a knowing that arises from deeper than thought. Sometimes it's clear immediately. Sometimes it requires patience, waiting for clarity to emerge. But it doesn't require the exhausting mental calculus the weak self-employed. This doesn't mean never using thought. Thought is a useful tool for planning, analyzing, creating, but it's used deliberately, picked up when needed and set down when done, rather than running constantly in the background like a machine that can't be turned off. Planning happens, but without the anxiety of trying to control the uncontrollable. Analysis occurs, but without the paralysis of overthinking. Creation flows, but without the critic intervening at every step. From presence, relationships transform completely. When you're not living in your head, you're actually with the person before you. You're not listening while planning your response. You're not hearing through the filter of past hurts. You're not projecting your interpretations onto their words. You're simply here, they're simply here, and genuine contact becomes possible. This creates an entirely different quality of interaction. Without the weak self to protect, there's no need for defensive posturing. Without the story of who you are to maintain, there's no need to impress or prove. Without the fear of judgment, there's no need to hide. What emerges is authenticity. Not as a practice behavior, but as a natural state. You simply are what you are, and others respond to that realness because they're starved for it in a world of performed identities. Conflicts, when they arise, are met differently. The thinking mind makes conflict about identity. They're wrong, I'm right. They attacked me. They don't respect me. Each conflict becomes a battle for ego survival, which is why they generate such heat and rarely resolve satisfyingly. From presence, conflict is simply a difference to navigate. There's no identity to defend, so defensiveness drops. There's no need to win, so collaboration becomes possible. The situation can be addressed directly, rather than through layers of reactivity. This doesn't mean becoming passive or allowing mistreatment. Boundaries are clearer and stronger from presence, not weaker, but they come from genuine self-respect rather than from fear. No can be said calmly, without explanation or apology, because it doesn't require justification when it's aligned with truth. Action can be firm without aggression, because it's not powered by defensive fear. From presence, work changes fundamentally. The thinking mind makes work into a performance and a threat. How am I doing? What do they think? Will this be good enough? The work itself becomes secondary to the meta concerns about the work. From presence, there's just the doing. Full attention on the task at hand. Energy flowing into the activity, rather than being drained by anxiety about the activity. This is how excellence naturally emerges, not from trying to be excellent, but from bringing complete attention to what is. The athlete in the zone isn't thinking about performance. There's just movement, response, flow. The artist creating their best work isn't evaluating every stroke. There's just the joy of creation, uninterrupted. The writer finding their voice isn't worried about judgment. There's just the truth emerging onto the page. These are all experiences of presence, of living beyond the head, and they reveal what humans are capable of when not obstructed by thought. Living from presence also transforms one's relationship with emotions. The thinking mind either suppresses emotions, dangerous, uncontrollable, or indulges them, righteous, justified, but either way remains identified with them. I am angry really means I am my anger. It defines me right now. From presence, emotions are weather patterns moving through awareness. Anger arises, moves through, dissipates. Sadness comes, is felt fully, releases. Joy bubbles up, is experienced, subsides. None of it is you. All of it passes through the space of awareness you actually are. This doesn't mean becoming emotionless. It means feeling more fully because you're not simultaneously thinking about the feeling, judging it, trying to change it. Raw emotion, unfiltered by the thinking mind, is actually quite manageable. It's intense but clean. It's the mental story about the emotion that creates suffering. This anger means I'm a bad person. This sadness means something is wrong with me. This fear means danger. When these stories drop, emotion is just energy moving. A man who has destroyed his weak self and learned to live beyond his head discovers something remarkable. Problems don't disappear, but they become workable. Challenges remain, but they're engaged directly rather than through the distorting lens of thought. Pain still occurs, but it's not amplified by resistance and narrative. Life has the same mixture of pleasant and unpleasant experiences, but they're met with clarity rather than reactivity. He also discovers a profound freedom, not freedom from circumstances, those remain what they are, but freedom within any circumstance. The external situation might be constrained, but the internal experience is spacious. He can be in difficulty without being defined by it, face adversity without being destroyed by it, experience loss without being lost in it. This is because his sense of self is no longer tied to conditions. He is not his circumstances, not his thoughts about his circumstances, not his feelings about his circumstances. He is the awareness within which all of this arises. This freedom manifests practically in countless ways. Fear of judgment drops away because there's no image to protect. Comparison ceases because there's no identity requiring validation through hierarchy. Resentment releases because there's no story of victimhood to maintain. Anxiety lessens because there's no future being projected as certainly terrible. Regret fades because there's no past being replayed as proof of deficiency. What remains is a profound okayness with what is. Not resignation. Presence includes the capacity to change what can be changed. But there's an underlying acceptance of reality as it is, which paradoxically provides the clearest position from which to effectively engage reality. You can't change what you won't first accept as true. The thinking mind exhausts itself fighting reality. Presence starts from reality and works with it. Living beyond the head also opens perception in unexpected ways. The thinking mind, so busy with its internal narrative, misses most of what's happening. It's not stupid or deficient. It's occupied, but presence, unburdened by constant thought, is available to actually perceive. Colors are more vivid. Sounds are richer. Textures are more distinct. Life becomes sensory again rather than merely conceptual. This matters more than it might seem. The thinking mind lives in abstraction. Words about things, thoughts about experiences, concepts about reality. Presence lives in direct contact. The difference is the difference between reading a menu and tasting the food, between studying love and loving, between thinking about life and living. Everything the thinking mind seeks, fulfillment, meaning, peace, exists not in more thinking, but in direct experience, which is only available through presence. From this space, creativity flows naturally. The thinking mind is actually terrible at creativity because it works through a recombination of the known. It can be clever, but not truly original. Presence, however, connects to something beyond personal thinking. Call it intuition, the unconscious, the collective, the source, whatever framework feels true. It's where art comes from, where insights arise, where innovation emerges. Every creator who speaks honestly will describe times when ideas seem to come through them rather than from them. This is presence at work, allowing something deeper than personal thought to express. The man living beyond his head also discovers that he can trust himself in a way he never could when identified with the thinking mind. The thinking mind is obviously untrustworthy. It contradicts itself, changes its position constantly, offers terrible advice decorated as wisdom, but presence, the awareness itself, has a quiet intelligence that can be trusted. Not thought trust, which is just more thinking, but felt trust, a deep knowing of what's true and what's right action. This doesn't mean perfection or never making mistakes. It means that when mistakes happen, they're learned from rather than used as evidence of unworthiness. When correct action is clear, it's taken without the paralysis of overthinking. Life becomes more like navigation than a test. Course corrections are natural rather than catastrophic. Another profound shift. The man living beyond his head is no longer destroyed by others because there's nothing for others to destroy. Criticism might sting, but it doesn't shatter. Rejection might hurt, but it doesn't define. Success is enjoyed but doesn't inflate. Failure is acknowledged but doesn't deflate. He becomes like water, affected by everything, defined by nothing, returning always to its nature regardless of conditions. This might sound like becoming detached or indifferent, but it's actually the opposite. Detachment is a strategy of the weak self, a way to protect against hurt by not caring. Living beyond the head isn't about not caring. It's about caring without attachment to outcome, loving without need to possess, engaging without need to control. This allows for deeper connection. more genuine care, more authentic love than the weak self could ever manage, because it's not tangled up with fear and need. The question arises, is this sustainable? Can one actually live this way consistently, or is it just a temporary state that gives way inevitably to old patterns? The answer is both encouraging and challenging. The shift out of head-identified living can become stable. It's not just a peak experience, but it requires ongoing attention and commitment. The thinking mind doesn't disappear. Thought continues. Old patterns are grooved deeply. The pull back into mental identification is strong. What changes is the relationship to thinking. You catch yourself living in your head more quickly. You recognize the weak self trying to reconstitute itself in new forms. You return to presence over and over, each time strengthening that capacity. This isn't work in the exhausting sense the weak self knew. It's more like maintenance, like hygiene. You brush your teeth daily not because they're constantly getting worse, but because without attention, decay happens. Similarly, without attention, the default mode of thought identification reasserts. But with attention, presence becomes more accessible, more stable, more natural. Practices help. Meditation is the most direct route for many, providing repeated opportunities to notice thinking and return to awareness. But any activity done with full attention cultivates presence: walking, cooking, creating, conversing. The key is attention itself, awareness of awareness, noticing when you've drifted into the head and choosing to return to here, now. Over time, this process becomes less effortful. Presence becomes the default, and thinking the exception rather than thinking being the default, with rare glimpses of presence. The tipping point is different for everyone, but it does come the point where living beyond the head is more natural than living within it. What emerges in this stable state is difficult to describe because it's not dramatic. There's no cosmic bliss, no permanent high. There's something more subtle but more profound, a deep okayness, a fundamental yes to existence itself. Not because everything is perfect, but because the one fighting with reality has dissolved. What is left doesn't need reality to be different, to be at peace. This okayness doesn't mean complacency or passivity. Action continues, change is pursued where possible and appropriate, challenges are met. But there's a different flavor to it all. It's engagement without desperation, effort without strain, care without attachment. Life flows through rather than being controlled by a fearful self. In this state, the original question, who am I, is finally answered. Not through more thinking, but through the cessation of the question itself. What you are is what you've always been: awareness, consciousness, presence, being. Not a separate self, but the space within which all experience occurs. Not something to protect because it can't be threatened. Not something to improve because it's already complete. Not something to understand because it is understanding itself. The man who has destroyed his weak self and left the prison of his head doesn't reach a final destination. He doesn't achieve some ultimate state of enlightenment. What he finds is simply himself, prior to thought, prior to story, prior to the weak self's desperate attempts at control. He finds what was always here, waiting beneath the noise. And in that finding, he discovers the truth of the statement. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Not because he's built stronger walls or better defenses, but because there's no false self to attack, no thought-based identity to threaten, no story to contradict. There is only what is, meeting what is, with nothing in between. Everything changes the moment you stop living in your head. Not because the world changes, it remains what it is, but because you're finally present to meet it directly, unbuffered by thought, undefended by false self, available to the full rich